30 years old, millions in debt, and standing in knee-deep mud. Simon Gallagher thought his life was over when he bought a rotting swamp shack for $10. But beneath the sinking floorboards lay a rusted steel vault, and a terrifying secret that powerful men were willing to kill for. At 29, Simon Gallagher had the world at his fingertips. He was the co-founder and CEO of Apex Logistics, a booming tech freight startup based out of Austin, Texas. He drove a pristine slate-gray Porsche, lived in a penthouse overlooking the Colorado River, and was engaged to a woman who wore a ring worth more than most people's homes. By his 30th birthday, he was sleeping in the back seat of a 1998 Honda Civic with a cracked windshield, clutching a plastic bag containing his only remaining possessions. The collapse wasn't a slow, tragic decline. It was a guillotine drop. His business partner, Martin Cole, a man Simon had trusted since their freshman year at Texas A&M, had been systematically funneling millions of dollars into offshore shell companies. When the federal auditors came knocking, Martin was already gone, having boarded a flight to a non-extradition country. He left behind a meticulously forged paper trail that pointed the finger squarely at Simon. Simon spent every dime he had on defense attorneys. He avoided prison, but the civil lawsuits and the catastrophic bankruptcy completely gutted him. The banks seized his penthouse, his cars, his investments, and even his mother's heirloom jewelry that he had kept in a safety deposit box. His fiancée left him the day his bank accounts were frozen, packing her bags in total silence. He was officially, legally, and profoundly ruined. He owed $4.2 million in restitution and had absolutely zero ways to pay it. Desperation does strange things to a man's mind. With exactly $84 left to his name, Simon spent hours sitting in a public library in downtown Houston, scrolling through county tax foreclosure websites. He was looking for a miracle, but what he found was Lot 402 in St. Martin Parish, Louisiana. The listing was bare bones, accompanied by a single, blurry photograph of a dense canopy of trees. It was a 0.2-acre patch of useless, submerged land deep within the Atchafalaya Basin. The property taxes hadn't been paid since 1982. The starting bid for the tax deed was $10. Nobody bid on it. Why would they? It was inaccessible by paved road, sitting in a flood zone infested with alligators and water moccasins. But to Simon, it was the only piece of the earth he could afford. It was a place where nobody could find him, where no process server could hand him another lawsuit, and where he could quietly figure out how to rebuild his shattered life or end it. He typed in his debit card information. The transaction cleared. For $10, Simon Gallagher became a landowner. The drive into Louisiana was a grueling blur of humidity and despair. By the time he reached the coordinates on his GPS, the paved road had long since given way to cracked asphalt, then gravel, and finally, a muddy, overgrown logging trail that his dying Honda simply couldn't traverse. He abandoned the car on the side of a dirt levee, strapped his duffel bag to his back, and hiked the last 2 miles into the dense, suffocating swamp. The air in the bayou was heavy, smelling of rotting vegetation, sulfur, and stagnant water. Spanish moss hung from the ancient cypress trees like ragged curtains. Mosquitoes swarmed him relentlessly, biting through his sweat-soaked shirt. When he finally spotted the structure on Lot 402, Simon fell to his knees in the mud and laughed, a broken, hysterical sound that echoed through the empty swamp. It wasn't a house. It was barely a shelter. It was a dilapidated, stilt-raised shack made of rotting, moss-covered cypress planks. The tin roof was a rusted sieve, sagging dangerously in the middle. Half the windows were shattered, and the front door hung off a single, agonizingly loud hinge. It looked like a stiff breeze would turn the entire thing into matchsticks. But it was his. Simon climbed the rickety wooden steps, his boots squelching on the damp porch. Inside, the single room smelled intensely of mildew and animal droppings. The floorboards were warped and soft, bowing dangerously under his weight. There was no electricity, no plumbing, just a rusted cast-iron wood stove in the corner and a decaying mattress frame. That night, a massive Gulf Coast thunderstorm rolled in. The rain hammered the tin roof with a deafening roar, and water poured through the gaps in the ceiling. Simon huddled in the driest corner of the shack, wrapped in a damp sleeping bag, shivering despite the oppressive heat. He had reached rock bottom. He was 30 years old, a former millionaire, hiding in a rotting box in the middle of nowhere. As the storm raged outside, the wind howled, rattling the frail walls. Simon shifted his weight to get comfortable, and as he did, his heavy work boot came down hard on a particularly soft patch of flooring. Crack! The rotten wood gave way completely. Simon's leg plunged through the floor, scraping his shin raw. He cried out, grasping the edges of the hole to stop himself from falling completely through the elevated floor. But as his boot hit the ground beneath the shack, it didn't sink into the soft, yielding swamp mud. It struck something solid, something that echoed. Clang. Simon froze. He tapped his foot against the surface again. Clang. Clang. It wasn't wood. It wasn't stone. It sounded exactly like hollow, heavy-gauge steel. And it was sitting perfectly level in the dirt, directly beneath his rotting floorboards. Simon barely slept. As soon as the grey, weak morning light filtered through the broken windows, he was on his hands and knees. The storm had passed, leaving a thick, humid fog rolling through the cypress trees. Using his bare hands and a heavy piece of firewood, Simon began tearing at the ruined floorboards. The wet, rotted cypress splintered easily. Within an hour, he had cleared a massive hole in the center of the shack, exposing the ground 3 feet below. He dropped down into the dark, cramped crawl space. The smell of the earth was overpowering, a mix of wet decay and a strange metallic tang that didn't belong in a swamp. He wiped away decades of accumulated muck, dead leaves, and silt with his hands. Beneath the grime lay a massive square iron hatch, easily 4 feet across. Simon stared at it in disbelief. The metal was pitted and rusted, but the structural integrity was undeniable. This wasn't some makeshift root cellar. This was industrial-grade engineering. Welded to the center of the hatch was a heavy latch mechanism, secured by a bulky, old-school combination padlock. Why would anyone build a reinforced steel hatch beneath a worthless shack in the middle of an uninhabitable flood zone? Adrenaline, sharp and potent, surged through Simon's veins. For the first time in a year, the crushing weight of his bankruptcy vanished, replaced by an overwhelming, insatiable curiosity. He climbed out of the crawl space, sprinted through the mud to his abandoned Honda on the levee, and grabbed the only tool he had to his name, a heavy, rusty Stanley crowbar from his trunk. By the time he returned to the shack, he was out of breath and covered in sweat, but his eyes were wide with frantic energy. Breaking the padlock was a grueling test of endurance. The lock was seized by decades of rust, but the thick shackle was heavy-duty steel. Simon wedged the crowbar into the U-shape of the lock and used a massive river stone as a hammer, bringing it down on the crowbar's handle with everything he had. Bang! 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 His hands blistered. His knuckles bled. But he didn't stop. He channeled every ounce of anger at Martin Cole, at the judge who froze his accounts, at his fiancée who walked away, at the universe that had stripped him of his dignity. With a final ear-splitting crack, the internal pins of the rusted padlock shattered. Simon tossed the broken lock aside. He grabbed the heavy latch handle with both hands, braced his boots against the iron plate, and pulled. The hatch groaned. The hinges shrieked in protest, a sound like a dying animal, as the massive weight of the door fought against him. With a surge of desperate strength, Simon heaved it upward, flipping the heavy door back until it slammed into the dirt. A blast of cold, stale air rushed up from the darkness. Simon coughed, waving his hand in front of his face. The air didn't smell like the swamp. It smelled dry, dusty, and faintly of chemicals and ozone. It was the smell of something that had been sealed away from the world for a very long time. He pulled out his smartphone, turning on the flashlight. The beam cut through the gloom, revealing a flight of smooth, poured concrete stairs leading down into the earth. Concrete, Simon thought, a chill running down his spine. The water table in the Louisiana bayou was mere inches below the surface. To pour a dry, concrete bunker out here meant someone had spent a staggering amount of money on waterproofing, deep foundation pylons, and industrial sealing. Millions of dollars of engineering sat beneath a $10 shack. Taking a deep breath, Simon gripped his crowbar tightly and began his descent. The stairs went down deep, 15, maybe 20 feet. The temperature dropped sharply, the sweltering bayou heat giving way to a bone-chilling coolness. At the bottom of the stairs, the flashlight beam swept across a surprisingly large room. It was about 20 feet by 20 feet, lined entirely with thick concrete blocks. Simon's light bounced off the walls, revealing chaotic, unsettling details. Pinned to the concrete were yellowing, water-stained architectural blueprints. Simon stepped closer, wiping a layer of dust off the paper. They were schematic layouts for various regional banks across New Orleans, Baton Rouge, and Houston, dated 1978. Red marker circled specific structural support beams and ventilation shafts. But it was what sat at the far end of the room that made Simon's blood run cold. Built directly into the back wall was a massive circular steel door. It was a Mosler bank vault, complete with a heavy locking wheel, multiple combination dials, and a maze of thick steel locking bolts. It was a door designed to withstand dynamite, drilling, and natural disasters. And slouched against the heavy steel wheel of the vault was a human skeleton. Simon stumbled backward, dropping his crowbar with a loud clatter. His heart hammered wildly against his ribs. The beam of his phone shook violently as he forced himself to look at the remains. The corpse had been there for decades. It was dressed in the rotting, tattered remnants of a high-end 1970s pinstripe suit. A faded silk tie hung loosely around the exposed cervical vertebrae. But the most horrifying detail was the skull. Dead center in the forehead was a neat, circular hole with a jagged, blown-out exit wound at the back of the cranium. This wasn't a hidden bunker. It was a tomb, a crime scene. Panic urged Simon to run. He was a convicted bankrupt hiding from the law in a rotting shack. The last thing he needed was to be tied to a decades-old murder in an underground vault. If the police found him down here, they would bury him under the jail. He turned toward the stairs, but the beam of his light caught something resting in the skeleton's lap. It was a thick, leather-bound ledger, surprisingly well preserved in the dry, climate-controlled air of the bunker. Beside it lay a heavy, tarnished brass skeleton key. Simon stopped. His curiosity, fueled by a lifetime of calculated risks in the business world, overrode his terror. He stepped back toward the vault, moving carefully to avoid touching the bones, and reached for the leather ledger. The cover was embossed with the initials A.H. Simon flipped the book open. The pages were filled with meticulous, handwritten accounting entries, dates from 1974 to 1981, and a list of names. But these weren't just any names. Simon recognized some of them from his high society days in Texas. They were the fathers and grandfathers of some of the most powerful politicians, federal judges, and real estate tycoons in the American South. Next to each name were staggering dollar amounts and cryptic codes. He flipped to the very last page. The handwriting here was different, frantic, jagged, and smeared with dark, rusted stains that Simon immediately recognized as dried blood. October 14th, 1981. They lied to us. We thought we were robbing the Iberia Parish Trust for the bearer bonds. But that was a smokescreen. The money was just a distraction. They wanted the New Orleans files, the blackmail, the photographs, the evidence that could collapse the entire state government. I realized too late. They killed Thomas at the safe house. I managed to get the files and the gold down to the swamp bunker. I locked the files inside the Mosler. I swallowed the combination. But they tracked me. I can hear the dogs out in the swamp. I can hear them walking on the floorboards above. If anyone ever finds this, know that Arthur Harrington did not die a thief. I died a loose end. Do not open the vault. The gold will make you rich, but the files will get you killed. They are still out there. They will never stop hunting for what is behind this door. Simon stared at the blood-stained page, the words burning into his retinas. He slowly lowered the book and looked up at the massive, impregnable steel vault door. He had come to the swamp to hide from his ruin. But for $10, Simon Gallagher hadn't just bought a piece of land. He had bought his way into a 50-year-old conspiracy. And as he stood in the freezing, dead silence of the bunker, a terrifying thought crossed his mind. If Arthur Harrington had swallowed the combination, how was Simon going to open the vault? And more importantly, who still owned the land surrounding Lot 402, the ghost in the ledger? Simon's heart raced with a rhythm that felt like a frantic drum solo against his ribs. He wasn't just a man in debt anymore. He was a man in possession of a ticking time bomb. The realization hit him with the weight of the Louisiana soil above his head. The ledger in his hands wasn't just a diary. It was a dossier. He didn't leave the bunker that night. He couldn't. Fear was a paralyzing agent, but it was also a stimulant. He sat on the cool, damp concrete floor, the beam of his phone dimming as the battery drained, and read every word of Arthur Harrington's descent into madness. The ledger described a group known only as the Syndicate of the Basin. It wasn't just a local criminal outfit. It was an intergenerational pact between old money families in New Orleans and high-ranking officials in the state capital. They had used the 1970s economic instability to launder vast sums of dirty money through regional banks. But the real currency was leverage. The files inside the vault were, according to Harrington, photographic evidence of a systemic cover-up involving a massive land-use scandal that had paved the way for the current industrial giants of the Gulf Coast. As the hours ticked by, the eerie silence of the bunker was broken by a sound that made Simon's blood freeze. A heavy thud from above. Something had stepped onto the floorboards of the shack. Simon killed his light. The darkness was absolute, a suffocating, heavy shroud. He held his breath, his eyes straining against the blackness, his hands trembling as he clutched the ledger to his chest. Creak! The floorboards above were groaning. Someone, or something, was walking slowly across the room directly above the hatch. Then the sound stopped. Simon waited for the hatch to be pulled open, for the sound of boots on the concrete stairs, for a gunshot, for anything. 5 minutes passed, then 10, then 30. Whatever had been walking on the floor had left. Simon didn't move until the first rays of dawn filtered down through the cracks in the hatch above. When he finally climbed out, his muscles stiff, his eyes bloodshot, he found no footprints in the mud. The storm had washed everything away, leaving the ground as smooth and treacherous as a mirror. But there was a mark on the front door of the shack, a small, precise notch carved into the wood at eye level. A symbol he hadn't seen yesterday, a circle with a cross through it. The warning was clear. They were watching. Simon knew he couldn't stay, but he couldn't leave with the evidence. He stuffed the ledger into a waterproof plastic bag he found in his trunk and buried it beneath the roots of a massive cypress tree a mile deep into the swamp. He took nothing but his phone and the crowbar. He drove to the nearest town, a desolate place called Bayou Gauche. He needed a connection, someone who could help him decrypt the ledger's cryptic codes without drawing attention. He remembered an old contact from his days in tech, Evelyn Thorne, a forensic data analyst who had been fired from a high-profile firm for digging too deep into corporate secrets. He found her living in a cramped apartment above a bookstore, her life as shattered as his own. "Simon." She stared at him, her face pale. "You're a ghost. Everyone said you were in the middle of a federal investigation." "I'm in the middle of something much worse, Evelyn," Simon whispered, sliding the ledger onto her desk. "I need you to tell me what's inside this, and I need to know why someone is still killing for it." Evelyn worked for 2 days, her fingers flying across a keyboard. When she finally looked up, her expression was one of pure, unadulterated terror. "Simon, you idiot," she breathed. "These codes, they aren't account numbers. They're coordinates, land deed surveys. These properties are now the sites of the biggest data centers and energy refineries in the South. This ledger isn't just history. It's the deed to the entire power structure of the state. If this goes public, every major political player from here to Baton Rouge loses everything." Simon and Evelyn realized the trap. They weren't just being hunted, they were being baited. The syndicate knew someone had found the shack. They were waiting for Simon to return, waiting for him to try and open the vault, waiting for him to make a mistake. But Simon was a strategist. He realized the only way to survive was to control the narrative. They returned to the swamp under the cover of a dense, humid night. Simon didn't just want the gold. He needed the files to trade for his life. But there was still the problem of the combination. Arthur Harrington had swallowed it. "He was a thief," Evelyn whispered as they stood over the skeleton. "He wasn't a poet. He didn't swallow it. He recorded it." Evelyn knelt by the skeleton, her flashlight beam scanning the bones. She noticed a faint, etched marking on the inside of the skeleton's ring finger. A thin, gold band sat there, so worn it looked like part of the bone. "The combination isn't in the book, Simon. It's on his hand." They took the ring. It was a custom signet ring with a series of tiny, laser-etched numbers on the inner band. Simon stepped up to the Mosler vault. His hands were steady now. He felt a strange, chilling connection to the dead man. He dialed the numbers. Click, click, clack. The tension in the room was electric. With the final turn, the heavy internal tumblers groaned, a sound of industrial metal sliding against metal. The massive vault door began to swing outward. It wasn't filled with gold bars. It was filled with boxes, thousands of microfiche slides, stacks of Polaroid photographs, and hundreds of cassette tapes, and at the very back, a small black velvet bag. Simon opened it. Inside were not coins, but diamonds, raw, uncut, and worth enough to buy a small nation. But as he reached for the files, a voice boomed from the stairs. "Careful, Mr. Gallagher. That's a heavy legacy to carry." Simon spun around. Standing at the bottom of the stairs was Martin Cole, his former partner, the man who had ruined his life. He was flanked by two men in dark, tactical gear. "Martin?" Simon's voice was hollow. "I didn't steal the money, Simon," Martin said, his voice cold and devoid of any warmth. "I was an operative. I was tasked with cleaning up the loose ends of the syndicate. I needed you to find this place. I needed you to open this door. You were the only one with the credentials to access the estate's legal holding." Simon looked at the files in the vault. He looked at Evelyn, who stood frozen in the corner. He realized the entire bankruptcy, the setup, the ruin. It had all been a long game to lead him to this swamp. "You want the files, Martin?" Simon asked, his voice steady. "I want the files, and then you can go back to being a ghost." Simon smiled. It was a cold, dangerous look that Martin had never seen before. "Evelyn, send it." Evelyn pressed a single button on her tablet. "What did you do?" Martin stepped forward, his face twitching. "I'm a tech guy, Martin," Simon said. "Before I came here, I set up an automated dead man's switch. If I don't check in with a secure server every 6 hours, the contents of these files, every scan, every name, every coordinate, gets uploaded to the FBI, the local press, and every major news outlet in the country." Martin paled. "You're bluffing. Try me. We have exactly 4 minutes before the first upload hits the wire. You kill us, the world finds out. You let us walk, and we might keep the names off the front page." The standoff lasted an eternity. The hum of the generator, the drip of water from the ceiling, the sound of their own breathing. Finally, Martin lowered his hand. "You think you've won?" Martin spat. "You're still a pauper, Simon, and you're still a marked man." "Maybe," Simon said, grabbing the bag of diamonds and pulling Evelyn toward the stairs. "But I'm a free pauper. And you? You have 4 minutes to find a place to hide." They didn't look back. They scrambled up the stairs, out into the humid night, and didn't stop running until they reached the highway. Simon Gallagher didn't become a billionaire. He didn't return to the penthouse or the Porsche. He disappeared, taking the diamonds and a fraction of the files as his leverage. He lived in the shadows, a ghost in the machine, ensuring the files were never deleted, always ready to drop them if the wrong people started moving too close. The $10 swamp shack was burned to the ground that night, taking the secrets of the dead with it. But the war for the truth had only just begun. Simon learned that some treasures aren't meant to be spent. Some are meant to be held over the heads of the monsters who think they own the world. Simon Gallagher's journey from the heights of wealth to the depths of the swamp proves that the greatest fortunes are often hidden where we least expect them. But at what cost does the truth come to light? This is only the beginning of a much larger web of deception. If you want to see the leaked documents or follow the next chapter of this investigation, hit that like button, share this story, and subscribe for the full, terrifying truth.